Hi, Laura. Hello.
Hi.
I'm really pleased to have you on to discuss this. And I've got so many questions for you, but I also want to let the conversation flow a little bit. So we'll see where we go with this, because I'd like to ask you about ADHD. And perhaps perhaps the easiest way to dive straight into this is, why are we here? Why have I asked you about this? What's your story? Why are you the woman to be talking to about this?
Well, yeah, and it is a story. So I reached perimenopause and realized that ADHD was a factor all my life, not during menopause, but my entire life. And the reason that I found this out is because my son had his diagnosis of ADHD. So my son is 17 now, but at the time he was 16. I'd known for his lifetime that we were dealing with something different, but I couldn't articulate it and I didn't know what it was. And the thing with ADHD is, or any of those neurodiversities actually, that it's not actually easy to get a diagnosis. So it's almost like, when you go to your GP and you're like, oh, I've got this symptom and I've got a little bit of this and some of that as well. What do you think's going on? And your GP kind of goes, oh, okay, well, this is what we're thinking. With ADHD, it's not that simple. So you're like, you sort of go to the doctor and say, well, I'm struggling to concentrate. I've got this, I've got that, and I've got the other. And we get a very different response. And I certainly had that with my son. So battling for your son obviously is very different to battling for yourself. So what I noticed was, and you will notice that I'll go off in tangents, and that is part of the ADHD. And as I start to unmask, I'm starting to say, just, do you know what, this is how I am. So you will notice that I'll go with different questions, but that helps, and I think that helps other people to recognize that in themselves as well when they're having conversations, that they're going, we're going over here. So already we've tangented for the first time.
That's fine.
So that was my little battle, or my big battle was to get my son seen for the difficulties that he had, because he had these amazing superpowers. He was able to, for example, learn how to pencil draw on his own in his bedroom, and then was able to do the most beautiful portraiture. He would take up photography, and before you knew it, had these amazing photographs. He would take up, I don't know, all different examples, crafting, creating anything out of material. He created his own lined waistcoat in leather, right? The absolute superpower brain. And yet going through school, we were told he's disruptive, he doesn't concentrate, he doesn't do. So actually all the flags there for ADHD, about ADHD, you can say, oh yeah, all these things are happening, that's what it is. But of course, as a parent, and actually if you're not a parent, you're a woman who thinks you may have it, where do you know that stuff from? Because we're not given that instruction manual, are we? No. Like, this is this.
Sorry. Is that why, sorry to interrupt, is that why you describe it as a battle? Like early on you said I had to battle, and that word just pops up in my flags up, like, oh, a battle, why is that?
Yeah, and it really is. So you've got the school system, where you've got, particularly with a child, and this is my experience going through school as well, where you're doing all right, your potential is probably here, but you're working here, and that's enough, because you're in that mid band. So as far as the teachers are concerned, it's fine. With the, check that pupil's doing fine, onto to the ones that are really struggling. So you kind of get missed in the middle, which is exactly what happened with my son. We could see this amazing potential, and we would hear this in reports, school reports: has so much potential, doesn't put in the effort, will not do his homework. We knew all this. These are all ADHD traits. Anyway, long story short, we got the diagnosis finally. Once he got into college, his tutor thankfully had a son who had ADHD. recognized it all, was happy to go through the whole process, and we got his diagnosis finally. And it was a really wonderful story for him to get his diagnosis, to know who he was in the world with his neurodiversity, and to try some medication. Now, obviously, during this process, my story is, I realize, a really, really common story for women who hit perimenopause,
right,
who recognize that they've been through this with a child, because it's very probable that if a child has it, that one of the parents will have ADHD. That's
okay,
very likely, very, very likely. So I'm hearing this again and again, this story of, my child's got a diagnosis. I've had some of the markers of ADHD, or some of the symptoms, or whatever we want to call it, of ADHD for years. But now in perimenopause, it is really starting to affect my life. Right. And that was me. Mm-hmm. Okay, so
what were you getting? What was it?
So absolute brain fog, menopausal symptoms. These are all menopausal symptoms, right? So brain fog, but some of the things that I found really difficult, which I'd found all my life, but were becoming almost excruciating, were things like being in a crowded room, mm-hmm. where there are conversations going on everywhere, okay, and you're having a conversation. And now I've always struggled my whole entire life of being able to tune in to every single conversation that's going around, and having a real difficulty having to tune in to that one. Now, with perimenopause as well, I was finding that symptom particularly difficult. That's why I loved being locked down. It was perfect for me. Because I was just online, I was on one-to-ones, I was able to function really well. When I went back out in the world after COVID, that's when I realized, oh my God, this is so much worse than I ever remember it being. And thankfully, I was able to put 2 and 2 together. So I was able to think, okay, son's got a diagnosis of ADHD. And when I started to tell people about his diagnosis, which isn't always easy, actually, because people will poo-poo ADHD. They're like, oh, he's fine. I don't know why you want to label it. And when I started talking about it, very close friends of mine and family, and my co-founder, I ran an organization before I was a full-time coach, and my co-founder, they all said to me, do you recognize yourself in the symptoms? And I was like, to start with, I was like, no. What do you mean? And then, of course, I let that settle and thought, oh my goodness, it all starts to make sense. And then, of course, I'm hearing this because now I'm talking to so many women. I mean, I'm actually openly inviting women to come and talk to me as I start to really collect and hear those stories, because I realize that my skills can be really used here, my coaching skills.
Absolutely. So sorry to interrupt, but that's really important. And I'm always building up my little black book of people who I can connect with and refer people to, which is a very clinical word, but it's really about getting the help and support that people need. So can people directly contact you and women contact you to have this conversation and feel a bit clear in their mind? Great.
So it's at the present moment, I'm inviting, and I think I always will in the future, but invite women in to just talk to me about this stuff, like talk to me about what's going on. And I'm in the process of putting together programs specifically for ADHD, because it's so huge. And what we're finding is, of course, is that people are going on TikTok, and me and my son are quite popular on TikTok. We've got a TikTok going on, and people are looking for this stuff. So, and that's where people are recognizing, oh my goodness, that's me. I've got that. That happens to me all the time. That happens to me. And it's a really interesting one. I know that there's a lot in the news about it at the moment, these people self-diagnosing themselves with ADHD. And I think it's ever anything that women kind of realize themselves or recognize themselves in something that the rest of the world are like, oh, you're just making it up. Why do you want to medicalize it?
Another label.
And we, of course, we don't like labels, but It's so important when we are going through our lives, sort of masking all of these symptoms. The outcome of that is burnout, so cyclical burnout, because we're pushing, can't do it anymore on the ground or in bed because we just can't, or ill. You know, or we're anxious constantly. We have anxiety, we have depression. So people with ADHD have much greater rates of depression and anxiety. And the reason for that is because they're constantly masking in a neurotypical world, which isn't made for somebody with ADHD.
Yeah. So do you think that combination of doing that and then the hormonal fluctuations that we're seeing in perimenopause, it's these clashes, isn't it? One exacerbating the other almost. And sometimes I'm also doing a little bit of reading up on this as well and following your work, and I'm thinking, how do we then pull apart, is it perimenopause or is it ADHD? Is it a bit of both? How do I know? How do I find out where that line is between the two, if there is one?
It is a really good question, because, and it's one that I get asked, because people are like, oh yeah, no, well, I've got those symptoms that you're talking about. I'm forgetting all the time where I put my keys, or I'm forgetting appointments, or I've got brain fog. And so the question that I would ask is, have you always had that? So before perimenopause, have those things happened to you, and have you found coping mechanisms to manage them, or is this a new thing? So that's where I would say we're either looking at perimenopause, or we're looking at perimenopause that has exacerbated ADHD symptoms, which you have been managing up until now, because they've been manageable in some way, shape or form. So we do, people with ADHD do manage their symptoms well until something goes wrong. And of course perimenopause is a great something going wrong, because the dopamine and serotonin are the two things that you'll see a difference in menopause, but you also see that in ADHD as well. So you can imagine with those hormone fluctuations, your ADHD symptoms are going to be far worse. It happens when just normally for women as well.
Yes, I was thinking that through a normal cycle we do get the drops and the peaks of estrogen and changing the modulation of those neurotransmitters, then surely we're going to see some cyclical effects, or those markers of ADHD, which again they could be mistaken for PMT or something along those lines, couldn't it? Yeah,
and I think that's really important, isn't it, in terms of that question around getting a diagnosis. I mean, we can talk about it, obviously we read about it and we know it, but you don't know until you actually go and have properly look at it. And and I hold my hands up, I haven't got a diagnosis of ADHD. I have all the markers, I recognize them. I'm still on the fence as to whether get a diagnosis or not. And that's a whole other discussion, whether to diagnose or not to diagnose, or whether to just kind of settle into the fact, oh yeah, now I know what's going on, everything else makes more sense, I communicate differently, so I can make my world a little easier for me.
So you've been able to do that and find a way through it, and
so
things
far,
a bit easier.
So far, but I do have times where I think, really I ought to go and do this diagnosis thing. And I'm still, I'm still very much in the thick of it, of sort of managing my son as well, and
yeah, of course,
and his ADHD and his future. And it's that it's that age-old thing, isn't it, about looking after yourself first. And I tell you, and I'll be really honest, what really puts me off is the waiting list. I mean, it takes so long to see somebody. But that's talking. It can take up to 3 years for an adult assessment at the moment, unless you go private, in which case you're still waiting usually about 9 months for a diagnosis, even privately. But what I would say is my symptoms are on the milder, what's the word, milder scale than other women that I've been talking to, where it is so apparent that something needs to be done now in terms of thinking about medication.
Yeah.
And so, you know, my son tried medication, and it was an absolute game changer for him. And I think seeing that difference, that he was able to kind of look into the neurotypical world and go, oh my goodness, is this how other people's brains? I mean, he actually said that, is this how other people's brains work? It's so
Wow.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a brilliant thing to hear him say. Gosh, yeah, that really,
yeah.
that really shows.
And to be open to try those treatments as well, which obviously you can't if you haven't got a diagnosis, because you can't access those types of treatments. So I'm very, very pleased that we went for a diagnosis for him so that he could experience that. But yeah, I'm still on the journey, honestly, with me. I'm still on the journey, and just in the process at the moment, like I said, of bringing as many women as I can into my community so we can really talk about, you know, what are the challenges that I can help with, because I can't help with all of them, but I've certainly got the skills to be able to help with a lot of them.
So yeah, what would they be? What could we get some help and advice from?
Well, I'll tell you exactly, because it's interesting, isn't it? As I sort of move over into this area, there's part of me that thinks, you know, I must learn about, you know, all of the different aspects. You can't know it all. But what I bring with me is, you know, a whole career of working with people with dementia. Now, you may think that's over there and ADHD is over here, but actually some of the symptoms are very, very similar. So some of those, well, executive functioning, difficulties with executive functioning. Now, I've spent my lifetime working with people who have difficulty with executive functioning. So I have that to bring along in my little toolkit, my little bag that I bring along. But also my coaching experience of working on anxiety and self-esteem, because one of the biggest things that I find with these women, myself included, is the messaging that we get from such an early age. You are a disappointment. You're a disappointment at a stage of, you know, even at primary school. There's some evidence to show that people with ADHD get, I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but it's something like that, get 30 or 40% more negative comments in their first 5 years than a child that doesn't have ADHD. So you can tell with that child brain how we start to think about the world, and we're getting this messaging: you're too loud, or you're not concentrating, you're not behaving in a way that expected. And then we go through a lifetime with these beliefs about ourselves.
Yeah. And we know, don't we, that those early years are crucial when it comes to confidence and building sense of self, values, self-esteem, beliefs about yourself, all of that shaping your later life experiences in a big way. And it's really difficult, isn't it, to go back and change that. I know from personal experience, as well as working with people. So that makes me cross to and really, really quite pissed off to hear that. Yeah. And I can remember at school going to school with I can certainly remember certain boys and some girls too who were picked up on for bad behavior and things. And it just makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe that environment did not suit them. It was not their fault. It was not their fault.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I hope these things are changing. And there's certainly so much more awareness now about neurodiversity. But the fact is, you know, we're talking about the past. We're talking about 30, 40 years ago, you know, so those are the things that I bring to the table, is the ability to change those beliefs. You know, I have the skills to be able to help people to identify how they are going forward in their life with a limiting belief, and then how we can get rid of that and take on new beliefs that make us feel better. And essentially that helps with the anxiety, it helps with the depression, it helps with the burnout. You know, that's how I've always worked with burnout, is, you know, it's about how we feel about ourselves and about what is okay and what is not okay. And there's something really beautiful about watching women with ADHD start to unmask, and I've felt that myself. You know, I was lucky enough to own my own business and run my own organization, so in some ways I was lucky in the fact that because I was at the top of the organization, I could just be Laura. You know, people You know, I had little nicknames that people used to call me, like last minute Laura was one of them. That is very ADHD, not being able to do the thing until the very last minute. So I was last minute Laura. You know, I was known for being a bit spacey, but incredibly creative. I was known for being able to pull off a project in one day. If the day was right, I could do that. But at other times it might take me 3 months. You know, that whole sort of ability.
I can see myself in that. Yeah, been there.
Yeah, to be able to use that superpower. So, and there's something but some women find that really difficult to do, particularly if they are in a job and they're working and they've got a boss and they have to kind of pull the line in a certain way. It can be quite scary to take off that mask and say, hey, we're looking at a neurodiversity issue here, but tell you what I'm really, really good at. Because actually leaders can get so much out of people with ADHD. They do have superpowers, but work very, very differently. So in that neurotypical space, it's why I could never work for anyone. I mean, I have worked for people, but I'm much better working for myself because I can create my own way of working and be creative in that. And the buck stops with me, which is really helpful because it gives me that, oh my God, I've really got to get this done, because no one else is going to do it.
Yeah. Have you got, just thinking of the time we're going to be finishing shortly, and I'd like to end it on a positive, but also end it with and obviously I'm going to add your details into this video so people can contact you easily and find you to continue this chat for themselves, because that's the value in this, really. But have you got any big really helpful tips that you've found, thinking of women perhaps your age or just approaching perimenopause perhaps, and starting to feel the pinch of the symptoms and starting to wonder if is this ADHD as well? What help can you advise on that front?
I mean, it's so wide, isn't it? Because there's so many different types of symptoms. But you know, one of the things that I'm just looking at it right now because you're asking the question, but one of the things that I use is my timer, right? So but one of the things that people with ADHD find really, really difficult is overwhelm, right? So you've got loads to do, you've got all your tabs open on your computer. You just let me talk you through this experience, right? So you decide to open your emails, and you get onto an email, and then you think, well, this needs a timely response, but another one's just pinged in, so I'll just read that, and then that email tells you that that they need something from you, so you need to do a little search to find the thing to take it back to, and as you do that, something else pings, right? So that's the brain of an ADHD person. And it's like, and before you know it, you're sat there thinking, I've just started about 7 things and I don't know how to move forward. And this is my top tip. So it's just a timer, it's just an egg timer. Set that to 25 minutes. Now, before you set that, decide what you're going to do. So you decide what are your priorities, you list it, and you say what you're going to do in 25 minutes, and you don't do anything else. So if anything else pings in, you ignore it. If the phone rings, you ignore it. If someone comes into the room, you say, I'll be 25 minutes. You just do that thing. And it's one of the best top tips. It's called the Pomodoro technique. And it's one that I use again and again. I couldn't survive without that apple on my desk. I wouldn't get anything done. So that, I guess that's one of my top tips.
That's a good one. And what I'm also noticing is that it's a physical thing. It's not a timer on your phone.
No, it really does. It has to be physical, and it has to tick, because it's that ticking that makes you stay to task. So yeah, that would be one of my top tips. But I think the other one is, you know, seek out, research it, seek out, do look at TikTok. There's nothing wrong with looking at TikTok to kind of start to find your tribe, and we're everywhere. So finding other women who are experiencing the same difficulties as well, talk it over. But one of the key things is to keep that momentum moving, rather than, it's very normal to feel a lot of grief when you first realize, and because you feel like you've lost a lot during your lifetime. You feel quite disappointed that there were things that you could have done that you didn't, and had you known, and had other people known, they could have supported you to get to where you wanted to go. So that's really normal. Take time to do that processing, but then think about your future and how can you live incredibly well with this amazing superpower.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really wanted to have this conversation, and yeah, we may well invite you back for a little group discussion off the back of this. But yeah, and people can contact you. I'll put the details for that in below the video. So you're on TikTok,
Instagram, and then I've got a Facebook group as well called Celebrating ADHD. And that's for mums and kids as well. It's like the whole family really can come and just to create a bit of a community there for people to chat.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.